So recently, Heria of OFFICIALTHENX uploaded a video about his weekly diet. I know I've been criticizing him a lot recently, but this video seemed particularly interesting because Chris heavily modifies his diet throughout the week because he feels this optimizes his training and his physique. So this gives us an opportunity to not only criticize his diet recommendations, but also his training strategies.
All right, guys, so we're back at the office, and let's take a look at this receipt here. We spent a total of $116 on all the food that we have here. So let's break it down real quick. So for a whole entire week, you're spending about $16 a day with what I've got right here.
So there are two things I can point out right away. For one thing, Chris is eating a lot of high fiber plant foods. He does have some fruits, lots of green vegetables, and he also eats beans and quinoa, which is great. Although he is eating some animal products, but he is choosing slightly healthier options, so he's avoiding foods that are high in saturated fat. So instead of eating red meat, he's eating things like chicken breast, ground turkey, and he's avoiding high-fat dairy products. So when he buys yogurt, he's eating Greek yogurt. This is a good start, and I'd say they're healthier options than what most people eat, but there are still some problems with these food choices and overall dietary choices, but we'll cover that later on. Also, he picked up a relatively small quantity of food. This is supposed to last him roughly 1 week, but he spent quite a lot of money on these groceries. He said he spent $116, and that's American dollars. That would translate to about 150 Canadian. That's a lot of money to spend on groceries for only one person for 1 week, and he could cut down massively on his grocery bills by just switching to a more plant-based diet. He could also just choose some more cost-effective options like getting frozen vegetables rather than fresh. But switching to a more plant-based diet would massively cut down on his grocery bills, and it would have the added benefit of increasing the amount of nutrition he takes in. So 3 of his major sources of protein in his diet are shrimp, chicken breast, and turkey. These foods are high in protein, but they're also more expensive compared to things like tofu or lentils, and especially with lentils, you can get them from dirt cheap, especially when you buy them in bulk from places like Costco. Now, I did mention earlier that Chris is making a smarter choice by avoiding red meat, which is higher in saturated fat, but with these leaner white meats, they're also very low in minerals and overall nutrition. So one of the benefits to switching to a plant-based diet is you get a lot more of these nutrients. If you take a look at Chronometer, 1 large serving of chicken breast will give you lots of protein at 41 grams, but not much of anything else. You hardly get any iron or zinc. You get some B vitamins and a bit of selenium, but not much else. And you also get some things you don't want, like trans fat and cholesterol, which increases your risk for heart disease. And a lot of people aren't aware of the fact that trans fats are naturally occurring in animal products, and they raise your bad LDL cholesterol levels just like industrial trans fats. Now, compare this with an equivalent serving of tofu. The tofu does have less protein per calorie, but you get far more nutrition with lots of calcium, iron, significantly more zinc, nearly the same amount of selenium, and the protein difference is pretty minor, but if you really want to eat more protein, you can also eat textured vegetable protein, or TVP for short, which is soy that has had all the fat removed. And that has even more protein density than chicken, and you have the added benefit of having much more overall nutrition. TVP is even higher in iron and zinc than tofu, and you can use TVP to make things like burgers or chicken nuggets. Lentils are also extremely nutritionally dense. You do have to eat more calories to get the same amount of protein because lentils also contain a lot of carbohydrates, but you do need carbs in your diet, so I don't see this as a problem. And again, you get way more overall nutrition, you get tons of iron, zinc, and not to mention fiber and antioxidants, which are completely lacking in the animal sources of protein Chris is eating. And that would be my main criticism of his diet. He's making some smarter decisions overall, but he'd be much better off sticking to a plant-based diet. He'd be able to get in the same amount of protein, but his food choices would be much healthier as they're free of saturated fat and cholesterol. They're high in fiber, antioxidants, and phytonutrients. and he'd save a ton of money at the same time. I only spend about $50 per week on groceries, and that's in Canadian dollars, because I use cheap foods like lentils as my staple foods. Now, cost savings might not be a big consideration for Chris because he's obviously making a lot of money with his business, but I'm sure a lot of his fans aren't as financially well off as him, and they'd really benefit from the cost savings of moving to a cheaper whole foods plant-based diet. And on top of that, you have all these health benefits.
And that's a total of 7 days. So let me break down what I have for you guys. I got the shopping list right here. We broke it down into proteins and carbs.
So I think Chris Heria has a body image and eating disorder, and I think this because of some of the things he says and does. So according to Chris, foods like broccoli, spinach, and asparagus are sources of food that are rich in carbohydrates? That sounds like something someone with anorexia would say. He also split up his foods into only 2 categories, protein and carbs, as if fat isn't a macronutrient you should be consuming, although I do recommend diets that are low in saturated fat. You do still need fat in your diet for proper hormonal function and to help you absorb fat-soluble vitamins like vitamin A or provitamin A carotenoids, vitamin D, and recent research has shown that poly and monounsaturated fats are hugely beneficial for preventing against heart disease. But Chris doesn't think this is important because he's terrified of gaining any amount of body fat, and he's convinced himself that eating a more balanced macronutrient intake, which is necessary for long-term health, will make him fat. I think you can tell just by looking at Chris, he starves himself. He does have muscle, obviously, from working out, but he's still very small and skinny. He hides this by using really flattering lighting and camera angles, especially on Instagram. But when he's out in public and anyone's next to him, you can tell just how small and skinny this guy is. Chris travels a lot to do workshops, and he's no bigger than anyone he's training. And when he goes to the LA Fit Expo, he makes sure to either wear a jacket or sweater so people can't see how skinny he is. This is a guy who prides himself in how great shape he's in, but when he goes to a fucking fitness expo, he doesn't even wear a muscle shirt, and I'm guessing that's because he doesn't want people to know he's skinny when he's near people who look like they actually lift. Now, I think body image and eating disorders are a serious thing, and I'm not trying to say Chris is less of a person or is a terrible person because he has these problems, but you have to be careful who you take advice from. It's probably not the best idea to take nutrition advice from someone with an eating disorder who isn't eating a balanced diet and appears to be malnourished. Now, Chris does primarily do calisthenics. He also does weight training, but primarily he's doing calisthenics or body weight exercises, and some of you might argue that he's just trying to keep his weight down so that he stays good with calisthenics. He doesn't want to be big and bulky and heavy, then it would be harder to pull himself up. And the reason he doesn't have these big, bulky muscles is because he isn't doing much weight training. He's mostly doing body weight exercises. But for comparison, there are vegans who do the same kind of training as Chris, but they're way more muscular, and they also happen to be eating more balanced diets. They're getting in a good amount of protein, carbs, and fats. They're eating grains, beans, legumes, nuts, and seeds, and they don't appear to be starving themselves, and consequently, they look much bigger and stronger. And the footage you're seeing is from the channel Bam Bam, or Bam Bum, I don't know how he pronounces it, but he's vegan. He's clearly way more jacked than Chris. So even if you don't agree with me that Chris has a body image and eating disorder, this at least proves a point that you can make significant gains as a vegan doing similar training as Chris Heria. So I know a lot of people like Chris, he has a lot of fans, but I think it's pretty obvious that his diet advice isn't the best. You'd clearly benefit from a plant-based diet and eating a more balanced macronutrient intake, and not starving yourself.
Now for the proteins, we have ground turkey. Where's that at? Right here. We have chicken breast. We have shrimp. We have salmon in here, and we got some turkey bacon right there. Oh, and of course, we got them eggs. free-ranged eggs.
So I mentioned before that these sources of protein are nutritionally deficient. You can get just as much protein and a lot more nutrition and save money by switching to TVP, beans, lentils, tofu as protein sources. But on top of that, there are some major health problems with these animal foods. Cholesterol is a big one. All of these foods are high in cholesterol, especially the eggs. And even though he's avoiding foods that are higher in saturated fat like red meat, this still has a negative impact on your LDL cholesterol levels, and this has been proven by a very in-depth meta-analysis. Cholesterol alone causes a significant increase to your serum cholesterol score, and this is the principal risk factor for heart disease. A recent study published in the American Journal of Cardiology also found that as serum LDL cholesterol levels increase, so does the severity of atherosclerosis, or clogging of your arteries, and it isn't until you get down to very low serum cholesterol levels, below 70 milligrams per deciliter, is atherosclerosis non-existent. So if you want the best heart health possible, you have to eliminate cholesterol from your diet, and that means not eating any animal foods, no meat, dairy, or eggs. There's no reason why Chris should include these foods in his diet. They're nutritionally deficient, and all they do is increase your risk for heart disease.
And of course, when I'm done eating my main meals, I have my snacks, which is Greek yogurt, Jell-O, bananas, grapes, and some raspberries that I like to put into the Greek yogurt. So
again, I don't recommend consuming any foods of animal origin for both ethical and health reasons. Even Greek yogurt, which is lower in fat and cholesterol compared to other dairy products, it is still lacking in overall nutrition compared to other plant sources of protein, and animal sources of protein tend to elevate IGF-1 levels, which is a risk factor for several forms of cancer, particularly prostate cancer in men and breast cancer in women. So again, it's just a better idea to switch to plant sources of protein. Another benefit to choosing plant sources of protein is that a lot of these plant sources of protein contain phytochemicals which help prevent and fight against cancer, like the isoflavones found in soy, with soy consumption being associated with a lower risk of prostate and breast cancer in men and women. And there are alternatives to virtually every dairy product, including yogurt. So if you really want to eat yogurt, then you could choose a plant-based option. There are plenty of soy and almond-based yogurts that are much healthier for you. What I also found strange is that Chris eats both low-calorie and fruit juice-based Jell-O. Both of these varieties, of course, are low in nutritional value. I don't know why he wouldn't just add more fruit to his diet. He'd benefit from the additional fiber and antioxidants, and I think real fruit is more enjoyable than Jell-O anyway. The fruits he does eat, like bananas and green grapes, they aren't bad, but they're not as good for you in terms of antioxidant status. He should add more apples, oranges, berries to his diet. Just cut out the Jell-O and replace it with healthier whole foods options. And Jell-O is pretty disgusting anyway. It's made out of gelatin, which comes from the bones and connective tissue of dead animals. I don't know of any negative health effects from consuming gelatin, but why would you consume something that's nutritionally deficient, doesn't benefit you in any way, while supporting unnecessary cruelty?
So I'm going to show you guys how I break all of this down. So now every single day that I'm eating, like I said before, it's going to be relative to what I'm training that day. So when I'm training, I normally have a heavy lifting day or something that takes a big overload on my body that I can only do 4 to 5 reps of. I'm going to be eating a lot of carbs that day. So I'm going to be carb cycling throughout this week. So that's going to be like my main carb day because I need all those carbs to be able to lift and give me all that energy to push as hard as I can. So for those days that I'm going to be eating a lot of carbs, I'll be choosing something from here. Maybe I would be using black beans, broccoli, quinoa, onions, and then I would choose one of my meats over here, whether it would be ground turkey and eggs. I would normally have about 4 to 5 eggs, something like that. And this would be one of my meals. Of course, I wouldn't eat this whole onion right here.
So again, Chris shouldn't be consuming any animal products, and he should be using beans, lentils, and soy products as a source of protein. He'd be getting a lot more nutrition in anyway, and he'd be able to get in the same amount of protein. And aside from that, this idea of carb cycling is just really stupid to me, any anaerobic activity is going to rely on carbohydrates as a fuel source. So I don't know why he thinks he has to eat more carbohydrates on heavy lifting days when on lighter lifting days he's still doing anaerobic training, and I'd assume he'd be training at a higher volume, as with lighter weights you can do more total repetitions, which makes carbohydrate intake even more important. Now, if Chris's physical activity fluctuates quite a bit throughout the week, then it would make sense for him to eat fewer calories on certain days, but I don't know why he believes he has to radically adjust his carbohydrate intake when it looks like he's doing hard anaerobic training throughout the entire week.
So another day I would be doing high intensity fat burning workouts, trying to burn as much fat as possible. Well, those days I wouldn't really be eating any carbs at all because I'm trying to burn as much fat as possible. So I want to use my fat storage cells, the fat that's already in my body, to use as fuel so I can burn that off. And then after I'm done training, I would eat a meal that would consist of mainly protein, not a lot of carbs, really next to nothing. So it would look something like this. Maybe I would have spinach and chicken. Now, of course, there's still carbs in the spinach, but there's very low carbs. If you want to add some shrimp with it and the eggs, there's another meal right there.
So on these low-carb, fat-burning days, it looks like Chris's diet becomes really bad, where he completely eliminates fruits, a lot of high-carbohydrate vegetables like beans and legumes, and sticks to nutritionally deficient, high-cholesterol foods like chicken, eggs, shrimp, turkey, which is a really bad idea from a health perspective. I think health and heart health should come above fat burning. This fat burning strategy also doesn't make any sense to me because it looks like on Chris's fat burning days, he's really just doing high intensity interval training, which is again an anaerobic form of exercise which relies on carbohydrates as a fuel source. Well, if you're not consuming any carbohydrates and you're doing anaerobic training, your body is going to break down protein and convert it into glucose as an energy source, and some of this protein is likely going to come from your own muscle tissue. I mentioned this in a previous video, but low-carb diets tend to cause more muscle loss because your body tries to make up for the reduction in available energy by increasing protein utilization, which partly comes from muscle tissue. So following Chris's fat loss strategy, it is likely going to result in more muscle loss, especially if you're dieting aggressively or you're trying to get really lean. Now, this brings up another issue with Chris's overall training strategy. He doesn't seem to keep specificity in mind, and he doesn't even seem to have any phases in his training. He's doing very different training styles throughout the week, and he's even in a caloric deficit on certain days. He has a really heavy lifting day, he has a more moderate intensity, higher volume day, and he even has a fat burning day, which I just think revolves around high intensity interval training. So he's not going to build muscle or strength effectively because he's not keeping specificity in mind, and his training doesn't revolve around specific goals at any one time. He's not breaking up his training into phases or macro cycles where in one phase of training he's focusing on strength building, in another phase of training he's focusing on hypertrophy, and in another phase he's focusing on endurance and high intensity interval training. No, he's just trying to do everything at once, and when you do everything at once and lack specificity, you're not going to make good gains in anything. And Chris is pretty small and relatively weak. I've seen him struggle squatting 185 pounds. I haven't seen him bench, but I have seen him do incline dumbbell presses. And again, he struggled with very little weight and he didn't even go down all the way. And none of this is surprising to me because he's constantly starving himself and he makes it even harder to build any muscle or strength because he has no real training strategy, and he just mixes up all these different forms of training and he ends up not getting really good results in anything. So both his diet and training strategies are not ideal for gains. Now, some of this is going to come down to personal preference, like if you're trying to lose body fat and you just personally prefer low-carb dieting, even if it isn't necessarily optimal, that's fine. But when you have things like low-carb days, high-carb days, days where you eat enough, days where you don't eat enough, you have fat-burning days that focus on high-intensity interval training, light training days, you're just not going to get the best results possible. In order to optimize results, you have to follow a consistent diet and training program. And lastly, this idea of a fat burning day is just downright retarded. If you don't need to lose weight, then why do you have a fat burning day? Again, Chris is just ignoring training specificity and adding in unnecessary bullshit that isn't going to help him achieve his goals of getting more muscle mass or stronger, and I think he's doing this because of his body image and eating disorders. And if you do need to lose body fat, then the ideal time to do that is going to be during a hypertrophy phase of your training. When you're doing something like strength training or focusing on cardio and endurance, your muscular system isn't going to be under as much stress because of a reduction in training volume. So unless your body is under training stimulus that demands the preservation of muscle mass, like during a hypertrophy training phase, then chances are you are going to eventually lose muscle mass while dieting, especially if you're dieting pretty aggressively or getting really lean like Chris Heria. And it isn't surprising that a guy who's constantly starving himself doesn't have much muscle mass. Chris just doesn't know how to properly structure his diet and training to get the best results, and this is really holding him back. So that covers most of my issues with Chris's What I Eat for the Week video. His main problems are that he just frequently undereats, the guy just looks malnourished, and I think that's really holding back his strength progress. And he should just stick to a more plant-based diet. He needs to cut out all of these animal foods that are high in cholesterol and eat more beans, lentils, soy products. I think it will benefit his health significantly in the long run. And he should just stick to a more balanced macronutrient intake where he doesn't do this carb cycling bullcrap, and he just eats more poly and monounsaturated fats to help with fat-soluble vitamin absorption, and it's definitely beneficial to his heart health. So if he makes these changes to his diet, I think he'd be pretty well off. And if you like this video, maybe consider supporting me on Patreon. I have some funding perks you may find interesting. If you're looking for clothing, then check out the Vegan Gain store. I have some new designs available. And as always, keep making those vegan and vegan-er gains.
Beef. What a relief. When will this poisonous product cease? This is another public service announcement. You can believe it or you can doubt it. Let us begin now with the cow. The way it gets to your plate and how.